Obviously, the reason Russia moved into Sevastopol wasn't because of economic reasons. It was for military reasons. It couldn't let NATO put hydrogen bombs 20 miles from Russia, because then somebody in the neocons would have said, hey, we'll never have a better chance to blow up Russia in the world than we have right now. Let's do it. So Russia's decisions here are cultural and military. It's not an economic decision to take the Crimea. It's a basic military national security decision.
Russia was pushed up against a wall. My view is that actually what's happened in Ukraine made it imperative for Putin to make a move. If he hadn't made a move, in this case, where a hostile government has been emplaced in the Ukraine with the definite aid of the West and with the threat of NATO coming forward further into Ukraine, if Putin did not resist this, Russia was dead. I think he had no alternative. The hostile government came into power in Kiev, and it was put in there with the help of the West. This constitutes really a great security threat to Russia. That would make it a kind of defensive action. You could argue that the real aggression came from the West. They engaged in what the former CIA officer Ray McGovern called subversive incitement. Maybe the most important point is that the West had engineered a coup in Kiev and placed in power a government that was definitely hostile to Russia and aligned with the West, posed the real threat that eventually they would close down the Russian naval base. So this was a genuine national security threat from the coup. There was that deal between Gorbachev and the high officials of Germany and the United States that in exchange for giving up East Germany, NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. There was an understanding, and that understanding was violated very quickly. And the West and the United States have moved east steadily. They've encircled Russia to a quite remarkable scale. They've even placed the missile defenses right at the Russian border, pretending that this was to protect Europe against Iran, which is a fraud that would fool nobody. So here now is the West again on the southern border of Russia.
We have to understand that when we start directly interfering, particularly our government officials, in the internal makeup of other governments, we're really asking for trouble. It is that very prospect that the United States and its European allies were trying to surround Russia with hostile bases that has raised the emotional temperature of all these things. And that was a huge mistake. As George Kennan wrote back in the 90s when this question came up, the decision to expand NATO the way it was done was one of the most fateful and bad decisions of the late 20th century. Russia now has returned Crimea to Russia. It has been most of its recent history in the last couple of centuries been Russian. The majority of the people are Russian. They clearly would prefer to be in Russia. We should start keeping our voice down and sort of let things work out. To ship in military equipment and so on is just going to be a further provocation. I think that what we have seen is a reaction in many respects to a long history of what the Russian government, the Russian president, and many of the Russian people, most of them, feel has been a pattern of American activity that has been hostile to Russia and has simply disregarded their national interests. That the U.S. systematically, from the time it started expanding NATO to the east without them, and then using NATO to carry out what they consider offensive actions against another country, in this case Serbia, a country which had not attacked any NATO member, and then detached territory from it. This is very relevant now to what we're seeing happening in Crimea. And then continued to place bases in these countries to move closer and closer to borders, and then to talk of taking Ukraine, most of whose people didn't want to be a member of NATO, into NATO, and Georgia. Now, this began an intrusion into an area which the Russians are very sensitive. Now, how would Americans feel if some Russian or Chinese or even West European started putting bases in Mexico or in the Caribbean, or trying to form governments that were hostile to us? We saw how we virtually went ballistic over Cuba. I think that we have not been very attentive to what it takes to have a harmonious relationship with Russia. We do have to understand that a significant part of the violence at the Maidan, the demonstrations in Kiev, were done by these extreme right-wing sort of neo-fascist groups. And they do, some of these, their leaders do occupy prominent positions in the security forces of the new government. And I think the Russians and others are quite legitimately concerned about that. Therefore, many of these things are not nearly as black and white when we begin to look at them as is implied in much of the rhetoric that we're hearing.
And millions of Americans have been deceived by the rhetoric that they're hearing, the false narratives fed to them by the mainstream media. That's why we must work together for the formal establishment of a representative press. Let's build up this platform. Please subscribe. You can also subscribe to the Representative Press blog. And for more information, see these 2 videos. These 2 videos expose more deceptions and deceit. See the links in the video description for the sources of these video and audio clips. Please use the tools below to share this video with everyone you can. Don't make a copy, just use the tools. If you use the tools below this video to share this video with as many people as you can, we can get this message out on a large scale.